So questioning is a good tool. Is it an ecological tool? No, it's a coaching tool. So when you say you see things that are quite beautiful in ecological dynamics, then I'm going, good on you, mate. Yeah, fine. Are you sure that they're only ecological dynamics?
Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching. In today's episode I was joined by Professor Dave Collins, coming from the University of Edinburgh to discuss a recent paper that Dave wrote, which is entitled Ecological Dynamics as an Accurate and Parsimonious Contributor to Applied Science, a Critical Appraisal. And that is in essence what it's about. It's a really constructive conversation that discusses good coaching towards skill learning in general. And actually tries to act as a way of, like, not necessarily, trying to bash ecological dynamics, but just to actually bring in the value of also considering coaching from a cognitive perspective. And we do that maybe at a stage of ecological dynamics where it's become so accepted, the constraint-led approach, for those that are familiar more with that terminology, it's been so accepted that we are at risk perhaps of blindly taking it in an absolutist way, that it's the only way and it explains everything 100%. And I think that's a wee bit folly. I think what we should do is be critical of ecological dynamics, just to counterbalance a little bit, just to ensure that there is a voice there that's also saying, "You thought about this," and that doesn't really hold there a little bit. So all in the spirit of enhancing skill acquisition, knowledge, and getting us closer to truth, so that ultimately we can help practitioners. It made me reflect a lot. There were some questions that I posed to Dave and he was able to kind of respond to, and it made me actually consider how I think and see things. So yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope you do too. Yeah, we'll get right into it. So Dave, it's great to have you here. How are you, just to start?
All good, mate. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, I've been really looking forward to this conversation. Also, we're going to chat about your recent paper, which was taking a bit of a look at ecological dynamics and, helping us, perhaps, and I say us, but, as a community of researchers, helping certainly for those that are positioned within that realm to just consider some points as we sort of then take it into the next level and hopefully aid its future development as well to a degree, ultimately serve the coaches. So we'll chat about each of the different points that you kind of made in the paper in turn, but I think before then it'd be quite interesting and I think helpful for the listener to kind of understand what are we talking about in this paper and what motivated you to write it as part of the research team?
I think what we're talking about in the paper is it's presented. So again, ecological dynamics is an extremely presented, pushed, encouraged. It's a lot of noise. There's a lot of material about it. There's a lot of presentation about it. But I have to say, Mark, I think it's often sufficiently uncritical. It doesn't necessarily look. I would expect, as a scientist, I'm after trying to make the most parsimonious argument. I'm trying to go, what's the best explanation for what we see? And frankly, as an applied scientist, I'm after helping coaches, teachers, people who are going to use it well. And I think my fellow authors and I were just a little bit fed up when there's a lot of difficulties that seem to be glossed over. There's also a lot of, for us, the it depends idea, the conditional knowledge idea, but the idea that there are lots of different ways of doing stuff and that some might be more applicable to certain circumstances than others. But that doesn't seem to be accepted. So I think what we were trying to do was to say, well, actually, here's a critical look. And it was important for us to do that at high level. So getting it published in Sports Med is quite nice. But it's just the absolutism of it. That this is the way, and it's the only way, and it's the best way.
And what are the potential dangers of that sort of more absolutist, narrative around skill, in so far as maybe not just seeing this as an academic activity, but actually as a practitioner, there's a coach at the end of this that's going to use this information. So what's your feelings on that, I suppose?
I think, right, first off, it's not a versus. Mm-hmm. So it's not an information processing or traditional or cognitive, call it what you like, versus ecological dynamics. Yeah? And it's not versus by us because we're going, this applies really well here, this applies really well here. In other words, it's not a versus, it's a balance. I think the second thing is there are 3 approaches now, and if you were to look at active inference or predictive processing, which is the newest kid on the block, you'd be going, okay, so there are lots of different ways of looking at this process. And I think the third thing is, if I'm a coach and I coach in a particular way, what you watch, what you see them doing, if they're an ecological dynamics approach, or if they're a cognitive approach, or there wouldn't be much difference. The differences come in the mechanisms as to what they think is working. So perhaps can I give an example?
So
can I give you an
yeah.
example? Okay. So I've coached weightlifting for a long time. If I'm teaching basic weightlifting, one of the things I might do is to get someone to squat facing the wall. And the minute they squat facing the wall, they have to stay upright. Their nose has to stay like that. They don't bend forwards. All sorts of good things happen. So I just use a constraint, as I understand it, to say to them, do this. Using that constraint means they don't have to say, look up, keep your back hollowed. So I can use the constraint and then something happens. Now, the difference for me as a coach is that I'll then go, when you face the wall, what did that make you do? Well, I had to do this and this and this. Okay. Now, interestingly, they're good style. If you've got a hollow back, if your head's up, etc., these sorts of things will happen. So now, there's the constraint. I'll add in the understanding so the person knows why they're doing what they're doing. And now away we go. So there's no versus there. How I would coach, you could look at and go, oh, they're using their constraint set approach. Fine.
Yeah. So is that a little bit, it's just that the word's almost been captured slightly in terms of constraint. And
but you see, words are important because they explain why you're doing. I've long said it's not what you do in coaching, it's the why that you do it. So it's the why I use that particular mechanism. And that's an idea that's been around with us for years. Mostyn's work in teaching and having the different teaching styles depending on the outcome you want to have. Shane Pill's recently done some work on that and taken that into a coaching line. So it's important. There's variety. People seem to recognize it depends, and that knowledge and application is contextual. And I'm just fascinated why some people have such a problem with that.
And is that, it seems like what you're getting at there, if I've interpreted that, Dave, is it's like the theory isn't pedagogy, because pedagogy is an implementation, pedagogy is in the coaching, that's how you actually, it's how you take knowledge forward, it's how you do it. The understanding the mechanism it's a related element, and I think people can do well to build pedagogy out of mechanism, but it doesn't need to be wedded to it and such, isn't it? Because the pedagogy is the messy part. That's dealing with people. That's where you not what's optimal, but what's needed sometimes, I wonder, situationally.
What do you mean by pedagogy?
So when I think of pedagogy, I think about strategies, tools, practical tools that I can use as a coach. So, or it might be even the ordering of exercises. It's it might be the feedback that I give during exercise, but it's a plan of process for achieving outcome. When I think of skill acquisition models and theories, it feels like it's helping me understand underpinning mechanisms and science of when A occurs, what preceded it, how things are occurring. That can help me in my pedagogy, but it's not necessarily it's not visible all times to the athlete. It's not visible all times to me as a coach. It's not maybe always helpful either, because I find myself sometimes when I'm coaching doing things that is a morphing of different ideas, different models. Probably it goes away from them. It's like and I think what I'm trying to get across is that it doesn't always seem that the science has to mirror the human element of coaching and the realism of what you're actually doing at the time with athletes, which is kind of like professional judgment, decision making about what the situation needs a wee bit. That's at least how I see it.
Which is why we did professional judgment decision making. But you see, the interesting thing, so if pedagogy is the method on practice of teach, okay, which is what I think you just said.
Yeah.
What would suggest that I'd use that method or that method? And part of that surely is the mechanism of learning.
Mm-hmm. So
So in other
mechanism
words,
of learning versus mechanism of what mechanism. So would you differentiate, like, we think about learning, at least as, I don't know, for looking back maybe in education elements like learning, but it's maybe built upon like pre-learning and it's built upon progress and those sorts of things. Is that a different learning from how an athlete learns skill and performs in sport?
no, it's no. They're just different contexts.
The different context that changes.
But you see that a big part of that is how this thing picks up and learns stuff. You know, so whether you're talking about a 3-year-old learning to, you know, I don't know, just do something pretty fundamental, or you're talking about a 33-year-old perfecting a technique in a highly technical sport or other environment, you're still talking about them taking in information so that they can then execute it. Now, ecological dynamics, as far as I understand, presents a very different picture as to the drivers of those mechanisms. In other words, how that works. Now, if they're right, then it makes a lot of sense to coach in different ways. So, you know, it makes a lot of sense to not insist on a particular perfect technique, which to me makes a lot of sense. So, you know, if Mark and Dave do weightlifting, Mark and Dave are slightly different shapes. And Mark and Dave are certainly different ages. So therefore, they'll do it in different ways. So the idea that there is one perfect technique which must be imposed is a nonsense. And like, I agree with them completely. They're right.
It's almost like, you know, if we suggest that learning is non-linear, the approach to learning, maybe the pedagogy that helps learning shouldn't necessarily be linear.
But you see, learning is linear.
It's
not linear. No, if you step back far enough, it's linear. If you go into it, it isn't. And that's okay. You know, I completely agree with you that the progression that a learner makes is not linear.
Well,
they tend to go in jumps.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think a little bit about, because I mean, a similar argument's been given around, or debate you've seen sometimes about modelling the coaching process, for example, where some people say you should or you shouldn't. And I'm actually starting to, I think this makes me think a little bit about that, about just the fact that, yeah, there's contextual differences in the way in which it occurs, moves through, whatever, orchestration, you know, these different ways of looking at it. But actually, there is a systematic element to, at a macro level, like there is certain things that do occur, and that is a linearity to it, and it's just that we don't always want to use that word. Because I wonder if this, and we are going to, you know, structure the conversation a wee bit here soon. I know we're just going to jump back and forward, but I wonder if this is a little bit about bad words in coaching now, because we're not allowed to say things like linearity, we are allowed to say things like traditional, we're allowed to say, you know, you get the sense of that. Yeah, no. It's the connotations, I suppose, like you get the sense of that.
But this is, again, you see, I mean, it goes back, Mark, to what we just said, to what I just said about why we did the paper. Because there are people who are saying they're pod priests. If you look at the literature in groupthink, you'll see that one of the things about groupthink is that there are people who sanction your language and sanction the way you think about stuff. That's not good. That's never good. You know, I mean, if you say what's wrong with an absolutist stance, oh my gosh, do we need to look around the world politics at the minute? What's the problem with an absolutist stance? Yeah? Whereas if you go, there are different ways of this operating. There are different ways of learning. And those different ways of learning might be more or less appropriate in different circumstances. And again, that's the basis of any sort of model of professional judgment decision making that gets the coach to think about how she or he is best going to teach this in this particular context. That's all it is. So if someone tells, I'm a stroppy little kid from Essex, and if someone says you mustn't, that's pretty usually an encouragement to me to do so. But the idea of there's language that mustn't be used, oh my God, that's worrying.
So as part of your motivation, and because you used the word sort of parsimonious, in terms of the meaning of that, is this about trying to make this simpler? Or is this about trying to reduce?
Okay, there's a lovely quote. I mean, Einstein says so much, but one of the things he said, make everything as simple as it can be, but no simpler. So, yeah, of course, that's my job. That's my job as a coach. That's my job as a coach developer. And I think it's my job as an academic. So it's not to come up with new words and new constructs unless those new words and constructs offer a better explanation. This is the point. Yeah, the number of papers I've read that says, in ecological dynamics, for example, an ecological dynamics explanation for this would be such and such. And I'm going, okay, but it is a better explanation. And I'm more than happy to recognize that lots of the explanations offered by, ecological dynamics approach are better. I mean, how could you not agree with direct perception? Because indirect perception, the idea that the brain's taking little snapshots and doing some calculations, it just doesn't work. But at the same time, if I come to, so imagine I'm a cricketer or a baseball hitter. The idea of perception-action coupling as an explanation for how the heck I could hit it is a very good one. And I wish I had it because I can't so badly coordinate, that's it. But when you come to, coaching a team, getting a rugby team to work in a coherent and coordinated fashion, now I'm going, actually, the cognitive approaches of, for example, shared mental models seem to make a bit more sense. So once again, it depends. What sort of learning am I after? What sort of change do I want to see in my learners, my athletes? Now let me use a particular method because I think it'll be more effective.
Could you scale that up a little bit, I suppose, to also, if you're talking about the learners, and a lot of times this conversation isn't used within coach education, I sometimes think about what does a learner coach actually require and what helps them, because, even in my own teaching, I've actually found it very difficult, and even when I'm, fairly versed, I think, in at least knowing how to practically utilise some of the elements of ecological dynamics, but a lot of student coaches that I find and young coaches, they actually struggle to pick up and understand ecological dynamics yet, whereas an information processing viewing things can feel simpler for them to understand and importantly use, is what we're saying here. I think going back to your point, it's not about trying to reduce complexity, but you do want people to be able to actually use the and get on with coaching and get on with like what they're trying to do in a way that allows them to develop the craft, experientially. And I sometimes actually think the fact that it's very difficult for people to pick up the approach and use it maybe is telling a little bit about the approach needing to get its conceptual clarity in order a little bit more, because I find that it's difficult sometimes work with young coaches to how to actually implement. I find it difficult sometimes as well.
See, I'm not sure
without going back to actually, what we want. Ultimately, what I want you to think about, I want you to think about a representative design. I want you to think about getting some contextual interference in there. I want you to think, but that's core, that's, dare I say it, traditional coaching, but they can pick that up and use it, and I just wonder, come back to like sort of what we're thinking here around it not being a versus, or, it seems sometimes when you start using the language like constraints and you feel like you have to put B with A and C with A and B, and it just becomes this whole difficult conversation.
An interesting point. I'm not sure that a constraints-led approach is harder to teach coaches to use. Yeah? But the reason for that, Mark, is because I'm so much into this idea of conditional knowledge. I mean, for example, representative design. Do you always want the environment to be highly representative?
No, because the parent game, for example, isn't always the best teacher. You want some sort of compartmentalisation to a degree, I think, personally speaking.
So therefore, sometimes you do want a highly representative design, and sometimes you don't. I'm happy. That's where I am. It depends. Where we go. Now, what element should be representative? Should it be the complexity of the display? Should it be the pressure felt emotionally? Should it be the problem solving, the complexity of the thinking? So now all of a sudden, there's more contextuality. So the whole point of where I'm coming from now is that being a coach is complicated. It doesn't get simpler as you get better. Just, the complexities change. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to get people to think about the declarative knowledge. So rather than the what you do, the why you do it. So what's the best approach in this? So if you go back to my favourite, you go back to Austin and you go, here is a teaching styles continuum, and at one end there is personal or guided discovery, and at the other end there's a command style. If I'm teaching abseiling by guided discovery is not a good idea because it's messy, people die, and the paperwork is just too horrendous, right?
Yeah.
So therefore I go to a command style. I say, I want you to do this, then this, then this. They feel safe, I feel safe, everything's better. If I was teaching a dance class, yeah, and that would be scary. I mean, my colleagues at Edinburgh would probably be laughing. You know, I don't teach many dance classes, but if I was, to teach a dance class by command style would be nonsense, complete nonsense. So what we're actually talking about is there's a variety of different approaches based on a variety of different contexts when I want a variety of different outcomes with a variety of different learners. Thank you very much. Therefore, does it not make sense that there would be a variety of different methods? And if it does, becoming a good coach is starting to think about which method I select. That's all it is. That's all it is, buddy. Nothing, you know, and if the words are complicated, sometimes they need to be. Years ago, there was a thing called the NCF, National Coaching Foundation, and it became Sports Coach UK, and now it's UK Coaching. And I used to write materials for them, and I'm a qualified in strength and conditioning, and I was writing materials, and they said, "Oh, you can't use anaerobic." Why? Oh, well, the coaches won't understand it. I thought that was dreadfully condescending, and of course it was an important concept. Let's use it. So I'm not shying away at words, Mark. That's not a problem. If I need to use constraints, I use constraints. If I need to use affordance, I use affordance. I sometimes wonder, in certain circumstances, wonder whether they are the most appropriate, the easiest to use constructs.
Because actually that was actually the question I was going to put back at you there, just insofar as being devil's advocate. I was going to say, well, but I think you answered that actually already insofar as that you're not trying to reduce complexity, but just be selective about what actually what's helpful, what's useful for that athlete or for that coach as well, depending on what level we take this. Maybe we'll jump ahead a wee bit. We'll take each sort of finding in turn, not finding as such, each discussion point in turn that you made, because I think all five of them are really important to kind of chew on. What we actually didn't do, just for those that maybe aren't as familiar with this concept at all, maybe as a bit of a whistle-stop tour, we're obviously trying to look at here about and you can add on the third model here from me, Dave, because I'm not actually as familiar with the third model, but where we often would position information processing, we see it as like the athlete looks at the environment, there's cues, not exact, solutions to what they have to do, so they make predictions. That's an assumption that the predictions have came from experience. There's been a representation of knowing what to do maybe in the past. Maybe that's attached to then, we remember those things. We adjust a motor program and the variants of how we do that to then attach to what the task requires. That's built up of a more generalized motor program, and then therefore that allows us to readjust and reparameterize still to fit different situations. That's the more sort of information processing view of things. I probably butchered it slightly, but that is that in a nutshell in a sense. Versus the ecological dynamics view, which is more that, movement emerges, we take away, or at least we dilute the role of cognition. Again, I know this was actually one of the first points you spoke about the conceptual clarity, but we take away that has been a major driver in it, and we actually think that we act to perceive, and we perceive to act, that the solution is there in the environment, and therefore, because of that, we need to start where we want to finish. Training should be about high variability from the start, because there's that assumption that we don't want representation to be a big factor in it. We go, it plays a big factor in it. So and then the third one, could you actually add to that third one? Just, I know it's not necessarily brought up in the paper, but I just want to know, this selfishly from my own learning here, Dave, the third model of how we might view the mechanism or the process of skill and performance. What was it?
There's a lot. Okay, so again, as with any theory, there's a lot of different wrinkles and stuff like that. But, I mean, the best way, of course, is to buy our new book.
Oh, there you go. That's a plug.
In which all three are explained. But simply, you just used it. You said predictive. I mean, one of the terms, active inference or predictive processing. And predictive processing is the suggestion that it is, that the brain is animals do it as well, but the human brain is a prediction engine. It's saying, I think this will happen, so I'll weight my attention to looking for that, So, there's a few rugby games on tomorrow. I think the star one's going to be Ireland, France. But I think Scotland are playing some small country to the west of that. So Scotland, Wales. Do you think that the Scottish and Welsh coaches have been scouting what their opposition does and predicting certain types of moves that might be more effective? Do you think they're doing that?
Yeah, otherwise there's no such thing as performance analysis.
I think the technical term here is no shit Sherlock. Of course they do. Do you think that when Finn faces a defence, he's now going to be, okay, stop lads, freeze frame, let me just work it out and do a bit of calculation, or is he just going to be reacting in a split second to the movements of what's going on? Yes. What does that tell you? It tells you that both approaches are right. It tells you that you want to predict, and what that prediction will do is make you more likely to look for certain things and more likely to take certain options. But that in the moment of the highly hyperdynamic control situation, you're reacting to information that is within the display.
Is that kind of like
that information was primed?
Yeah.
But in the moment, you're controlling it like that.
It kind of reminds me there was a paper, who was it by? I think it was Ashford. There was a 2021 paper, and they spoke a little bit around fast think versus slow think, and they were trying to bring this as a bit of a hybrid. They were trying to unify this space, because just people would also argue back, Dave, and say that actually you can't have, it can't be that the brain's firing in one way and then the changes. Well,
hang a minute, why not?
That's the exceptional.
Mike used to work for my company. I published with Mike, and I'm well. I actually didn't agree with that paper. We can go into that if you like, but never mind. But tell me, why doesn't the brain have different systems?
I know.
Our body does have different systems. Our body is a mess of different systems. Yeah. You only have to look at, the old knee-jerk reaction. Yeah. That doesn't use the brain, or dancing, which might use the brain. You know what I mean? We're used to. We're a mess of different systems. What's wrong with having different systems?
Has the evolution of, so you see sometimes with like psychology as well, and also strategy being within psychology, has neuroscience caught up with this debate, I wonder? Because actually, I know we're jumping forward here, but a lot of the stuff, just you meant, just because you see a lot of, I would say that a lot of this debate is preceded the more recent development of understanding. We still don't really understand how the brain, like there's so much complexity to how the brain works, and I wonder, is the brain more malleable than what we probably are giving it credit for? And maybe I would say
that this argument has ignored, some parts of this argument have ignored what neuroscience has. Yeah. So if we know that there is perception-action coupling, then it would be good, wouldn't it, to see how that works? Clearly, we've got that. I'll give you an example. When a long jumper runs up to the board, okay, the classic method is to measure out the run up and put a marker, a little bit of tape on the side, yeah, and then to start there, and then away you go. And then if you overstep the board or you're short, then the coach will go this or do this. They'll tell you to modify. An ecological approach says that doesn't happen. What you do is, as you run up, the board subtends an angle in the back of your eye. That's called a tau angle, as in the Greek letter. And that when you hit a particular value of tau, because of course if you're getting closer and closer to the board, the angle's getting bigger and bigger. When you hit a certain level, you then make adjustments unconsciously, almost automatically, to hit the spot. Fine. Now, I don't agree with optic tau as an explanation, and we ran a study that said, okay, what's the prediction of the traditional, what's the prediction of the optic tau? And we found that of 12 world-class horizontal jumpers, only 2 followed the optic tau, and the most followed the other. Okay, but it's a case of, if that operates, where's it operating? Is optic tau detected at the back of the eye? Is optic tau in the optic nerve? Is it detected in the occipital cortex, the visual cortex? Yeah. Now, that would be a really good study to do, wouldn't it? Why hasn't it been done?
And is there just maybe not, I don't know if it's, there just hasn't been enough collaboration between neuroscientists and maybe want to look into that just to understand performance, and perhaps the narrative that is still very trying to win an argument, perhaps, that's from the ecological side of things, that maybe that it's not wanting to go into it. So, I don't know.
It's been dropped off enough people's Christmas cards.
No, I won't get that.
I'm not going to go there. But my point is this: if you want to get better quality evidence, then surely you use a variety of tools. I'm very, very, my own work, as I say, my doctorate was in EEG, electroencephalography. I've used movement kinematics, I've used biochemistry, I've used blood, I've used a broad range of measures, because I think that broad range of measures enables me to get at the truth or a more accurate answer. So if I'm presenting a certain position, then surely I would go away and look for the best evidence.
Well, no, and to be fair, without getting into that sort of thing, because actually I think it's a good segue.
It's a good talk.
It's a good segue, however, I think, into talking about. So I sense that uncertainty, and I think, and what really resonated with me was the first element of the conversation, the conversation piece. I don't think that's the right word. Your conceptual paper and just debating some of these things, where you spoke a little bit about inconsistencies in the narrative when you actually read the paper, not just like across papers, but within it, where we go, well, there is no cognitive element to then not necessarily, and there's in words. So maybe if you can expand on that, because, and again, or maybe we've maybe spoke to that enough, actually, because it just it seems obvious that isn't really helping us understand what you're actually getting at. And also, I think, where do we go next with that? Because research can very easily go into a rabbit hole where it's largely the idea, and then you get 5 other studies to do that idea. And if we aren't very careful and direct about where we go, then you end up getting a lot of studies that aren't taking any closer to the truth of things. And, at least we need someone to just not be on the fence too much with it.
I'll give you an example. I did a paper in 1990, my gosh, with a very talented researcher called Alicia Goginski, and it was on, at the time, the 2 competing theories of how imagery worked. Okay? And basically what we showed was that if you were into this camp, you choose these sorts of tasks and you do these sorts of studies because you get the answer that you wanted. If you're in this camp, you do these sorts of tasks and these sorts of studies. And I think that's a very common issue. I think what people tend to happen is they almost look at problems and design studies that give them the answers that fit with their existing proposal. So if I'm into ecological dynamics, I would tend to do a very short-term task that was very see-do, very perceptually actiony. Yeah. Like hitting in baseball. And I go, okay, let's collect some data. And by gosh, if I manipulate the constraints, I can improve performance. QED. There it is. I'm right. If I was into most cognitive methods, then I'd go and look at the extent to which there were shared mental models across a team, and that drove the team to take more consistent actions and predictive actions for each other under certain circumstances. Now, because I am sitting on the fence, well, I'm not sitting on the fence. I'm actually saying I can have my legs on both sides of the fence, which is a slightly uncomfortable position, depending on how sharp the fence is, but that's okay. I can see that both work. I'm comfortable with both. I accept both. I look at the data and I go, they're both the best explanation. They're both the most parsimonious explanations. But what that means is that we've got at least 2 systems being operated.
So it's that, it goes back to the malleability
and then that's
element.
Fine. That's fine.
You mean, you remind me, because and I know that, that has been addressed before in some papers, that there is sort of methodological bias, and it's even insofar as the tools probably used, like it's not as common, for example, like I think from like ecological dynamics position papers to like use things like interviewing and stuff like that. But then if you consider like other things that I think jumped out, and tell me if I'm not connecting the right things here, but you mentioned at one point in the paper, Dave, around like metacognition, And metacognition's quite an important thing. It's coming out more, I think. I mean, some of the stuff around gamifying learning and coaching's really cool, and I think because it's starting to help us understand it's not just about teaching someone how to solve problems, but teaching them about how they know themselves to solve problems, and like, you know, that's expertise. We need. I don't think all of performance can't be purely procedural. There is an element of knowledge and understanding at least what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I would wonder if that's maybe not been equipped as much. Similarly, I would wonder from an information processing side of things, I wonder if that's also taken advantage of. And look, you're more versed in this literature than I am, Dave, but is there an element of not seeing consistency of experiments in the way that they're designed? Or is it just
I think it's right.
Tell us then base ideas on. And
right. I find it hard to comment because I don't see lots of studies that go, we're going to look at this from a cognitive point of view, and then away they go. I think that where they're coming from is that's where the person's situated, so that's what they do. So you could look at naturalistic decision making, the idea of what's called recognition prime decision making. So, I've been here before, I've recognised it, I'll do this. The idea of shared mental models, the idea of sense making. Okay, so that's all quite cognitive-y stuff. But then at the same time, I've described, a number of studies which are very elegantly, the most elegant explanation for what's going on is this idea of, dynamics flow. I mean, there's a very simple idea that occurred I read about called looming. And the idea of looming is that if something comes towards you, you go, oh, bloody hell, get out of the way. So if I do that, you do that. Yeah, you've done it because, of course, you recognise them on the screen. But that's the idea, right? Now, looming, most animals do it. Very young babies do it. Looming is a perfect example of perception action. Okay, fine. If I'm a boxer, I don't do that. If I'm a boxer, the punch comes towards me and I slip it and counter. So what I've had to train to do is to acquire a new action associated with a similar perception. Make sense?
Yes, but is that not where?
How might that work? So if you've got any karate, boxing, taekwondo, any of those sorts of coaches listening, that's something they have to do. They have to condition away from what is a very inbuilt sort of almost reaction to something coming towards you, and they have to learn a new one. Well, that's fine.
And does that then come back into that question? And I don't know if this is, I keep asking the wrong question with this. I then want to then just naturally go, is that because his performance postural? Is that because they've developed this generalized motor program? Or is it because they're deciding the situation's different, so they're emergent? And is this maybe, again, the wrong narrative? Is it that we're just seeing, look, they're both remembering what they've drilled, jiu-jitsu or whatever, they're remembering what they drilled 100 times over, but they're also aware of the environment, and the environment's helping them get information, and that's fine. That's not both things occurring.
But you see, okay, and you're making a really good point, Mark, because what you're now saying is that the mechanism of how it's working is actually quite important. Because if it is just an emergent property, and my apologies, that's not me being pejorative or dismissive at all, it's bloody complicated. However, if that's what it is, then I would coach in a very, very different way to if this is the way you've been drilled to it. Yeah? And so now all of a sudden, what the coach is going to do, how the coach is going to do it, is very, very underpinned by how she or he thinks the thing's operating, the mechanism again. So this is why I keep harking on about mechanism, not because I'm not being particularly stroppy. I'm just going, if you know how something works, try this. If I'm an endurance coach, I will design sessions for my athletes with a really good thought about the mechanisms, the impact of that on them physiologically.
Yep.
So now all of a sudden the mechanisms through which long, slow distance, aerobic intervals, and aerobic intervals. And furthermore, it's very, very not recipe. It's very, very, let's try it. I have these methods now. And it's also very contextual. Yeah? As to what Mark and Dave might do, because they're different ages and stages and whatever. So there's loads and loads and loads of conditionality So again, why the problem with conditionality in motor control?
Mm-hmm. I thought also like, should I see a connection between that point? I think there's also a question here about how in arguments where we are comparing more contemporary approaches to coaching, if there is such a thing, with traditional approaches. Sometimes I think traditional approaches, they're almost portrayed as a bit of a caricature. Like but like Alan, there is such a thing as really good traditional coaching. Like there's really bad drills and there's really good drills. You know what I mean? Like there can be
I'm right with you. I look at the straw. Can I say straw man? Is that okay? The straw person. If I look at the straw person created by some of these authors and to that's traditional coaching, that's dreadful. I have to say I've never seen it. I have, and I've been around a long time and I've been seeing, no. I mean, there are lots of parallels here, which we could go into, which aren't necessarily pertinent to this, but it's, I don't see a lot of, hard drilling type coaching. And I haven't in the past. Oh, by the way, I did in the military, but then I was being trained to jump out of an aeroplane and sort stuff out, when it went wrong. Or I was taught to do a stoppage on a weapon, which I had to do the right way and very quickly under pressure. So again, that's a very traditional drilly, which I love as the Scottish abbreviation for a PE teacher. It's a very drilly sort of way of doing stuff, which is fine. But in that circumstance, go back to Mostyn and the Mostyn, the command style, the drill style is good. So again, I'm in a quandary. I don't know. Well, we published a paper called It Depends, and the It Depends coaching, and the subtext to it was either the biggest cop-out or the most fundamental principle of coaching.
I've read the paper. It's a good paper.
Okay. Which do you think it is? Is it a cop-out or is it pretty fundamental?
Oh, it's just, and again, people debate this. My personal opinion, I don't think it's a cop-out if we believe in structure. I think you use it's like improvisation's a form of expertise, like the structured improvisation to the extent. No, I don't think it is. I think there'd be more risk attached to doing the other way, and I suppose if I'm doing look at probabilities.
So I understand that a couple of guys have written a paper on one of the constraints websites, Constraints Collective or whatever, that says that's a nonsense. We're picking and choosing. It's can you mix? I'm going, of course you can mix. We all do. Well,
that comes back a wee bit, Dave. You make me think like we were talking about a drill. So I've done drills before where it's shooting or whatever, and maybe it's the players getting different shots that they take around the bots. Now, it's not dynamic play, but we're trying to create variability, but it's still within a controlled space as such. And it's like, that's all right. Like if I do that well, it's not going to damage them. It's still going to give them repetition without repetition to some degree. It's not like, and I think that, but whereas I think the way that we think about traditional coaching, and I even see this in higher education, like I need to make a point now about making sure when we do modules with students that we don't show them traditional coaching and then show them new coaching, because it's like, it makes a villain of it. And it's just that, bad traditional coaching's pretty poor. Just cones and there's nothing else to it, and it's just dribbling in a berry. But good traditional coaching, it's good. It's good coaching. I wonder.
Did you ever see a film called Ron Roy?
No, I'm aware of it. I've not seen it.
It made me laugh because all the goodies had Scots accents.
Oh,
and all the baddies had English accents.
That goes.
All the guys who were like in the middle had Anglo-Scots. It's like a sort of black hat, white hat, and cowboy stuff. No, I'm happy. Clearly, I'm English and clearly very bad. But it's the same thing.
Yeah.
They're different horses for courses. Things fit into certain circumstances. And again, I cannot see the problem with that. It is almost evangelical. This is the way. What? How can you not laugh? No, there's a variety of different explanations. No, that's fine. And if you were to go into neuroscience, for example, there's a dorsal and a ventral stream. Information comes in and it goes through one pathway in the brain if it's going to get named and identified, and it goes through another pathway in the brain if it's going to be very rapidly reacted to. So there are two systems, at least. Yeah.
Is there also, Dave, what's your thoughts? And I don't suggest this to suggest that there's then that means that I think you're wrong. But let's say like there's what's optimal, right, on paper, and sometimes there's what's needed when dealing with a person. You know, like in coaching, like, you know, so let's even take the example of drill. Imagine in some world, right, where there is a more absolute that drills are just bad, right? Let's just say, right. But what if my athlete, and I've done this before as well, players sometimes feel confidence through doing certain things, and there's a psychology sometimes to doing it. And sometimes I don't actually think every session needs to be about learning. Sometimes sessions can be about performance and just getting athletes doing something with ease enough times that they feel, you know, there's all reasons for why we do things. You know what I mean? So like, I think that comes into it a little bit as well. And this is where we need to be careful, I think, about the science of skill acquisition being too far removed from the art or the relational element of coaching. That's far more messier.
Completely right. So if, for example, you're familiar with a biopsychosocial, yeah, right. So if we put that into this context, and the bio bit would be psychomotor. This is the way in which motorically I best acquire and execute a skill. There's also the psychobehavioral, the psychological bit in the middle that says, actually, if I was to do a drill on that, it might not be the most efficacious way of me improving my ability to do it, but it might make me feel confident. And then there's a psychosocial bit that other people look at me and go, Dave can do that. That's all right. I can trust him if I pass him the ball in that circumstance. So you're very right again, Mark, that what we're talking about is that we're not just talking about the control of movement in a particular context or contexts. We're talking about a biopsychosocial model. And again, you'll find this covered in our excellent book, Poetry for Human Kinetics, available. Sorry.
What is the title actually, Dave? What is the title of the book?
Okay, my apologies. It's basically skill acquisition, integrating theory and practice.
Integrating theory and practice? No.
And that's edited by Jamie Taylor and myself. I think it's a cast of sort of top class people. I'm just pulling up on my screen to sort of to show you where the thing is. But it's as I say, Human Kinetics out in January. You know, help yourself. But you see, and the way we wanted to title it, it depends coaching, for a whole variety of reasons. Because what we were after was a view that said, here are lots of different ways of doing it. Yeah, but all of those different ways of doing it they have their validity. Here we go. Sports skill acquisition, integrating theory and practice.
No, great. I'll try and leave a show link for that in the show notes.
That'll be absolutely to help super, you.
That's great.
That'd be absolutely super.
But just another. What I think we're getting to with this, I think you've maybe alluded to this already, but it makes me think about a conversation of how different people. And actually, I had a conversation recently. We spoke a little bit off air. I had a conversation not that long ago with Mark Williams, and it was this whole thing. I think going back to yours, it's like just getting away from some of the stuff that's confusing things for us, like not in the sense of trying to dilute this complexity, but just let's just focus on what really matters at the macro level. Sometimes, at least maybe if I'm not the coach listening in, and I just want to use information. We know that like specific practice is really, really important, you know, and you're not doing things that aren't related to the sport you're doing. That's where again I worry a wee bit, and this is and I want to actually come on to talking about what the real benefits and value of ecological emphasis. There's so much of the constraint-led approach I think's like quite beautiful actually as a concept and how it explains things, but like and like there's some wacky elements to it. Just to say that, right, in the sense of like differential training. Like I really like that as a bit of a franchise mechanism, if you want to call it that. But we can take things too far sometimes, and I just think that, you know, we can go too far into it. That if you dilute the importance of one thing in order to talk about the other, although again, what ends up happening is specificity becomes, I don't know, it gets put to the side or whatever, and we start seeing a million different balls getting used in training, different stuff, which should be good to a point. But it's like we need to bring things back in sometimes to what can be, what allows for reps, what allows for organisation. So I just think that all the core principles that we spoke about, these things to simplify it enough.
So, okay, two examples. First example, using a a tennis racket that's the right sort of size for the learner. Is that an ecological?
It sounds like common sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
But if you were to read in constraints-led approach textbooks, they claim that as being, that's it, look, you're manipulating a constraint. No, you're not. You're just doing what's bloody common sense. Now try this. What's the difference between a conditioned game and a constrained practice?
It's just, to me, like that. This is what I mean. And thankfully, I can detach myself from this a little bit. I just think it's just the language that you're using. It's the same thing.
Right. Now, you're right, except for one other thing that I think might be a difference. And the difference is the extent to which, in the conditional game, you then question to bring out the principles of what was going on, and then you talk about those principles as to how you might transfer it into another angle. Now, as I was getting myself ready for our chat this morning, I looked at a rugby coach putting out a constraints-led approach method for teaching offensive play. And pretty much what he did was he went, okay, so there's this drill or this drill, and then he would stop and say, now let's talk it through. What's happening here? So you stop, and then you get them to talk about what's going on and what might work better. I mean, you're getting them to engage cognitively in reflecting on what's happened. So all of a sudden, I'm going, well, there might be not too much difference. Shouldn't, if all the information is in the display, why would you get people to talk about it? Now, I'm completely agreement. I don't know, Jim, what's your sport, Mark? Football?
Football, yeah.
Okay, fine. So, my ball's pointed, but, I'm right with you. That's okay. I worked in football. And I'm looking at a circumstance and going, it makes sense to me to get people to think about and talk back and forth and get sort of ideas that they can use to make sense of it. Yeah. It makes more sense to me to do that with a bunch of 18-year-olds than it does to do it with a bunch of 8-year-olds. However, it's still a good idea. Okay. So questioning is a good tool. Is it an ecological tool? No, it's a coaching tool. So when you say you see things that are quite beautiful in ecological dynamics, then I'm going, good on you, mate. Yeah, fine. Are you sure that they're only ecological dynamics?
No.
Or are you sure that they're being used in a mixed way? Now, I'm happy with them being used in a mixed way. I think I think it's important that they're used in a mixed way. But it's when they are and when they're not. So it's the why and why not. That's the key bit. Now, if that's a bit long-winded, I'm sorry.
No,
all I'm saying is it's the conditionality. And I'll keep hammering that.
But no, it makes me think, and you think back to what we mentioned earlier on about sometimes the traditional being seen as a caricature. I also think the sometimes people who are quite heavy into the information processing thing, they also make constraints appear as if there's no element of prescription to a degree, or there's no element of telling people what to do. Like that, for the same reason why I wouldn't just continuously just subject an athlete to a circumstance in training where they're just repeatedly failing over time. You eventually need to step in and tell them what to do sometimes to a point, and sometimes, and even guided discovery, while the athlete is self-regulating to a point, you're still leading the process. There's still there's coach direction within that there's still an element of that happening within it. Therefore, there's an element of prior knowledge being passed on, and there's an element of athletes having to cognitively think through what they're doing. Like, these things all happen anyway. And I think there's an irony, if I could even speak from my own field a little bit. If we want to give athlete empowerment, we want them to lead the process. Autonomy is meant to be supported, otherwise the coaching process kind of collapses in itself. There's got to be an element of coach has a plan, coach helps deliver the plan, and even in a conversation, there's got to be an element of coach direction in that. I don't think that.
Really, do we really want it always to be athlete-led?
No, because there's what the athlete wants and what the athlete needs are different things, isn't it? It's
exactly. Yeah. So I had some real concerns with the overly simplistic ideas that are engaged in something. The idea of play their way. So the children should always decide what it is they're going to do. Sorry, nonsense. From a safety point of view, and anyway, from they don't know what. That's why they're there. They're there to do it. But all I'm saying is that you're right. We mustn't be prescriptive, and anybody who's prescriptive in any direction is probably sometimes going to be wrong. Again, there's a quote Jamie uses in our book: everything works somewhere, but nothing works everywhere. And I'm right with that, mate. Now, whether I'm watching Mark coach and I go, "Hey, Mark, what you doing?" and he goes, "I'm constraining to afford. I'm doing," and he uses that jargon, or he says, "Oh, I'm using a condition game because then we're going to do this, that." Okay, that's fine. Now, his explanation as to what he's doing, i.e. the why, is an important bit of Mark as a coach. And if I'm the coach developer, I'm going to him, so what were we trying to achieve with that? And were there better ways? But that doesn't mean that I'm going to be prescriptive and face him with a baseball bat and say, no, it should be that way. It means, okay, if that's the way you coach, mate, these are the consequences. Let's explore them.
Yeah. And I come from coaching kids, and again, if we even relate that back to the science and then the actual art of dealing with people in the biopsychosocial realm of it, you can ask a kid questions, but see if you aren't then conscious of the fact that, see if the kid gets the question wrong, that can impact their confidence and their ability to then engage with more discovery learning. You're probably better telling kids enough information to give them a baseboard to which they can then start to engage in questioning. So there's things like that come back into it. I wonder, I think we've managed to touch.
Just a quick example of that. So one of my colleagues, a lady called Amy Price, who's a superb football coach.
Is that the gamification stuff, Amy?
No.
Sorry,
it's not gamification. And this is the point.
Video game design led.
Yes, so baby.
Yes.
Some webinar people hijacked it and called it gamification. And I think she said, no, it's not. Now, the gamification's good, but it's something different. But where you look at Amy's use of a video games approach to coaching football with young performers, works beautifully. Yeah. But again, it's coach led, but athlete centered. Fine with that.
And it's I'm glad you made that distinction actually to correct me on that, because I think gamified stuff, it's more about they emphasise the intrinsic value and how they get engagement, and then but Amy's stuff is more about the metacognitive components with it. Yeah, it's a good distinction. So yeah, the one point I think we haven't maybe touched on, or maybe we have, but I thought it was a useful. Maybe it's anecdote, or if it's useful. It was a useful point of your argument in the paper was where you talk a little bit about how what we can maybe learn from skill refinement as a way of understanding this sort of how both things maybe work together. Because skill refinement is asking people to deliberately focus their attention internally to a point to reopen up maybe, I don't know, postural elements that we then need to automatize again. So is there any relevance to me saying that? Have we already touched on that, or do you think that's useful, David?
No, I think that's it's one of several arguments that we make in a paper. And again, let me please emphasize, the paper is not eco-bashing.
No.
It's but it's important. We're just giving some examples of where it's not absolutely the nuts. When you're talking about skill refinement, so something that I've learned to do, and I mean learned, and internalized, and it's automated, but there's a flaw in it, or I want to change it for some reason, then one very good method to do that is to de-automate it, to call it out into consciousness, as you just described it, do some tweaking and put it away again. And this is the work I've done with a guy called Carson, a colleague at Edinburgh, and also an author on this paper. And skill refinement is a good example of calling things into consciousness, to then make a modification and put it away again. So yes, if I'm a coach, and most coaches would probably, no, that's unfair. Lots of coaches will look at a situation and go, gosh, this person's got a flaw because they weren't coached properly early. I'd like to change that. And in which case, they can draw on the literature. Our approach is called the 5A model. We're doing a lot of work in that with golf at the minute. But then all of a sudden you come out and go, oh, okay, here's a method that makes use of a cognitive approach to pull something in, do something with it, put it away again. So no, it's a good example, mate.
Yeah. And what I wanted to get to, because we haven't, I think we have got to this point in the conversation, but I mean, I don't see this as you've said it yourself. This isn't eco-bashing. And I think, at the same time, I think an information processing led view of things that side of the fence, we won't even get onto defence talk again. There's things that they maybe aren't so great answering either, like if it's even just why can't athletes maybe describe how they do things? There's elements of tacit knowledge inside of that. How do beginners manage still to coordinate movement when they just don't have any prior learning? There's loads of things, and that's what I think maybe we can give this whole segment to is actually really praising the work Ecological Dynamics, and that they are really bringing to the forefront the interaction between the athlete and the environment in a way that I think offers another piece of the jigsaw puzzle, like in the same way I think the cognitive side is also bringing in an element of that puzzle that we just aren't able to give attention to. And I think that's great, and I just think
I'm absolutely fine. I'm absolutely fine with that. Absolutely fine with that. No problem at all. The classic triangle, person, environment, that's kind of absolutely fundamental. Yeah, and of course that's going on. Interestingly, you brought in something else as well, which is the psychosocial dimension, which is external to that triangle. Yeah. So yes, of course you're right, and that's why there's nothing so again. There's no practical as a good theory. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But part of that practicality for a consumer, like a coach, is how good is this? How generalizable is this? Yeah. Are there circumstances where it's less effective? Now, that's for me as a coach educator, as a coach developer, as a researcher in this, and as a coach myself, I would be looking and say there are circumstances in which this explanation works really well. And there are circumstances in which it's a bloody silly idea. Yeah, just like using guided discovery to teach our friend.
But that kind of comes back to the point I made earlier in the conversation, Dave, where I was saying about why I think it's difficult to teach, and it's maybe that I need to be better at teaching it. But sometimes it's like your iPhone. You want to be able to use it to do good things, but you don't need to know about how it was made. And I think it's difficult sometimes because the conversation seems so entrenched in the process of learning that I think we lose sight sometimes. I just think coaches want not simplicity, but I think they do want something that empowers them to really act on it creatively. I think once you give them, like talking about like some of it almost becomes like physics. It's almost like talking about physics, a lot of the stuff like ecological dynamics. I think maybe it's about how do we need to buffer some of that, I think, when we're working with coaches, because I think coaches just want to know, how do I make this representative? How do I make this in a way that, variable? How do I get the athlete to be good? And I don't know what your experience has been.
But you see, what you just said, how do I make it more representative? And yet, earlier in our conversation, you've agreed that there are circumstances in which you don't want it.
I know.
I'm really sorry, but a good thing to do would be to say to a coach that there aren't absolutes. It's not that representative is better representative, more representative is always better. There are certain
That's true, Dave, actually, because even when I say that, I go, we need to make this look at the core tenets, but actually in itself, representing practice in itself is tricky.
But what you're saying in terms of jargon, the explanation, and I go back to that Einstein quote, make everything as simple as it can be. Fine. But no simpler. And if we oversimplify it, and one of the things that the early work in the cognitive approach, the information processing approach, because it was driven at the time, was staggeringly oversimple. The idea of a simple motor program, or a central command structure, clearly didn't work. And in actual fact, the researchers at the time, and I'd highlight the work of someone like Dick Schmidt in this, were very much no, this isn't how it works. But if you were to go and look at the work of, say, Bjork in Desirable Difficulties, when it is useful to put someone in and make them have difficulties, or our own work, which talks about why executing errors is good for learning. Now, there's just a paper, Rob Gray, I think, just has a paper out, and he's saying, look how important this is, look how good this is about using errors in learning. We're going, yeah, but it's out. It's out there. There is an awful lot of, as we say in the paper, old wine in new bottles. So if I am a coach and I just want the best practical answers, yeah, I'm right with you, yeah, but recognise that the right practical answers have to have a bit of qualification in. Like most of the time, a representative design is best, but not always.
That's interesting. I mean, that's one of I'm going to take for this conversation. You've done well there to illuminate my own inconsistencies, because I actually seen that as like, oh, do you know what, maybe I've got something here, but then you need to be consistent with it. It's true. So let's I think it's quite apt that you've went on to that, because at this point in the conversation, Dave, what I try and do is with some of my guests is I want them to kind of give me 2 or 3 like coach hats. So like, again, because we want that coach that's listening to this to have something tangible that they can take away. I know this is partly practical, but there's a conceptual element. There's a wee bit of abstractness to this. What would be if you were to summarise this conversation and you want coaches to take 3 things away from what we're saying, or 2 things? You tell me what matters most. What would it be, building on what we've just spoke about there? Oh, sorry, I think we disconnected just momentarily there, Dave. Yeah, you can hear me now.
Sorry, I've got you back, mate. I can do that. Okay, fine. So we've got a thing called we've got a thing with Big Five, and we've used it to good effect to work with quite experienced and experienced coaches to manifest change. So you go, right, so you've just done a session. What did you do? Why? Give me 3 alternatives that you considered before you started the session. What would have changed in the existing situation to make you use one of those instead? And finally, when and how will you know that you made the right decision? So what have you done? Why? 3 alternatives that you considered. What would have changed to make you choose one of those alternatives? And when and how will you know that you got it? Right. Okay. Now, that is a method. You don't do it all the time because you'll go bloody mad. You do it sometimes because it requires you to think about alternatives. Coaches are creatures of habit. Humans are creatures of habit. And you tend to get in, this is my favourite practice for this. And every so often you need to look at it and go, what did I consider as alternatives? Second of 3 take-homes. Think about how it works. If someone's told you that this is down to shared affordances, go, that's interesting. How does it work? Where's it stored? What sort of kind of things go on? Yeah. Third and final, there's loads of different ways of skinning a cat. If I can say that with the RSPCA listening. Yeah. So therefore, rather than, confine yourself to one principle or another, get on. I have friends who are Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Buddhists, whatever. I mix with Celtic and Rangers fans. It's all right. Yeah. It's okay. We can talk to each other. We don't need to put ourselves into one camp, because I'm absolutely sure that one camp is not absolutely right.
Yes. Yeah, and that's the main thing I would take for that conversation. Actually, I really like the first point you make there as well. I think, and it's interesting because it's not the typical response you get from a guy in sport skill acquisition, because you put it more on just let the coach reflect and learn from their own experiences and get better at coaching as a craft because of that.
It's very hard to reflect and learn from stuff you don't know.
Aye, exactly. So, no, look, Dave, thank you so much. You've been really generous with your time, and it's a great paper. It's like, and I think it's well placed in that it's we need at intervals of I think any idea. We need some people to be critical and to and it's part of moving the practice forward. And I think that's something everyone should be get behind. I think
not being too pushy, Mark, but I think that's what we tried to do with the book. We tried to go there's not just 2, there's at least 3. But now here's the way they work, and here's how you might choose between. So have a gander. See if it's useful for the guys at UWS.
Brilliant. No, and the listeners as well. Absolutely would encourage anyone that's listening in to check that out, and just to keep up to date with some of Dave's work. It's good work. It's very critical in all the right areas and complementary in all the right ones too. So great. No, thanks so much. And for those that are listening, I hope this conversation has been as useful for you as it certainly has for me. We will see you next time. Thank you, Dave.
See ya.